Thank you for attending the study on Ecclesiastes and Job in the Lifeway curriculum. This is session 9 and the text is Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verses 1 through 15. The lesson summary statement is on the board. The wise person stewards time, realizing God controls all things. The way I'm going to start the lesson is I've written some activities up on the one side of the board. Sleeping, eating, dressing, so forth. And on the other side, I have the amount of time that those things are, that people give to those things. But I've mixed them up. And so in a 70-year life, you will spend a certain amount of time sleeping and dressing and going to church. And so I'm just going to ask the class to help draw a line between which one is which and the time frame. For sleeping, it's 20 years, eating 6 years, dressing 5 years, using the telephone. Now this is a dated one, so it's not necessarily an iPhone or cell phone, but using a telephone is 1 year. Waiting on someone is 3 years. I've told people that's how I got my education, studied while I waited on my wife. Church is a year and a half. And so just to bring out this idea of time. There's a little poem that says, I only have a minute, only 60 seconds in it, just a tiny little minute, but all eternity is in it. Peter Drucker, the famed management consultant, has said, time is the scarcest resource, and until it is managed, nothing else can be managed. Again, our lesson summary statement is the wise person stewards time, realizing God controls all things. And what I want you to see is how that works its way out in this text. Now let's look at just an overview of where we've been in the book of Ecclesiastes that brings us to chapter 3. He begins in chapter 1 through 11 talking about this cycle of life that seems meaningless. The sun rises in the east and crosses the sky, sets in the west, and then runs back to start that process all over again. The wind blows from the north and it blows to the south, and then it returns just to start that cycle again. Now to you as a believer, you look at the world and the travel of the sun and the wind, and it's beautiful. It speaks things to you. But he's talking about a person who doesn't have a relationship with God, and this world has a monotony about it, a boredom about it, a meaningless to it. It doesn't have a point. That's verses 1 through 11. And then last week is our Sunday school text, chapter 1, verse 12 to chapter 12, verse 11. It talks about these various diversions that he went into. He tried work, and he tried wealth, and he tried wisdom, and all kinds of activities. But what he discovers is that apart from God, it is empty. He does discover in chapter 2, verse 12 to 26, that wisdom is better than folly, but the problem is the outcome is the same. Both men die. But then Solomon discovered that God intervenes in the affairs of men. That's the last part of what our Sunday school lesson was about. And this discovery gives him hope that maybe there is meaning to life. And then we begin our study in chapter 3. So if you focus on time, doing whatever God wants you to do, there you will find meaning. That seems to be the way the flow of the text goes together. So the first point of our lesson is time and place. The wise person stewards time, realizing God controls all things. In chapter 3, verses 1 to 8, there's this series of opposites that are pointing out each has its place in life. And the wise person is going to understand how he can steward those individual events because God is in control of those events. And so I would just read through the text and then ask the class, what's the obvious word that stands out? And it's the word time. And in the Greek language, there are two words for time, and this Hebrew text was translated into a Greek text called the Septuagint, and they picked a particular word to translate that word time. There's two words. One is chronology. Chronos, we get our word chronology or calendar from it. It's consecutive time. It's the date of your Sunday school class. It's the time of your Sunday school class. And then there's kairos, and that is a word that talks about an opportune time. Now, our worship services start at 8:15 and 10:50. That's chronos time. But at the end of the message, I give an invitation and ask people to receive and respond to the message and to respond to Jesus Christ. That's kairos time. That is an opportunity to do business with God. And so I explained this issue of time, and then I asked them, can you give some examples of kairos time for these various pairs? And what I'm hoping to do is, as we talk about these pairs, if there needs to be a further explanation of that, we will do that. For example, when there is birth, what is the opportune time for that? Well, of course, it's in a certain age, but at that point, a person focuses much of their time and energy on rearing children and developing a family. And so I just want to kind of help see how you take advantage of those times, because you see, that's what the Sunday school lesson is driving towards. It's saying that a person who's wise, he knows how to utilize time. He stewards it. He manages it well because he understands God is in control of these things. When these things come into our life, whether it's life or death, whether it's time of planting, whether it's a time of uprooting, whether it's time to tear down or a time to build up, whatever those things represent in terms of a person's life, God has brought those into our life, and there's an opportunity for us to do the work of God and experience the person of God. That's what I'm wanting to drive at. And after we've had a chance for that, I want to draw a picture on the board for them to kind of get a understanding of what Solomon's doing in this very famous passage of verses 1 through 8. This picture that I have on the board is a picture of a cube and a person's inside of it. There is a sense in which this passage, this poem, has a dark tone to it. You know the famous song by the Byrds from 1965, in which they basically just quote this verse in their song, and it has a pleasant tune to it. But that's not the tune that Solomon has in his mind. It's a dark tone. It's a discouraging tone. It's just like that idea of the monotony and the boredom and the pointlessness. And what's being pictured here is there's this swinging of events, birth and death and planting and uprooting and killing and healing and tearing down and building up. But the person who lives under the sun lives in this existence. He doesn't see outside of that existence. And so it doesn't make sense to him. It seems as though it's pointless. It's absurd. It has no meaning to it. It's empty. And so what Solomon is wanting to do in this text is he's wanting to introduce what our Sunday school lesson is saying is there's another dimension. And God introduces and enters in to this dimension that human beings are living in. And when God does that, that changes everything about the perspective of how you're viewing life. If there is no God, then you're born and you die. If there is no God, there's times of weeping and there are times of laughing, and it has no significance to it. It has no purpose to it. But if there is a God, and He's the one that's in control of these events, this swinging back and forth of events of life, then that gives it altogether a different interpretation of how these events take place. They become meaningful. And if they're meaningful, if there's importance to it, then it also becomes an issue of stewardship. How do we manage, how do we utilize these times to the fullest of our benefit and to the pleasure of God and the will of God? So there is, first of all, this first point, time and place. Secondly, is enjoy life. The wise person stewards time, realizing God controls all things. Verses 9 through 13. Now what's happening in verses 9 through 13 is Solomon is reflecting on this poem. And he asks this question in verse 9, what does the worker gain from his struggles? And in essence, what he's talking about here is who is really in control of my life. The word gain here comes from a word that means a portion of that which has been divided. And he's wanting to know, what's the portion that God has given me? Who's really in control of my life? And then in verse 10 he asks, I have seen the task that God has given the children of Adam to keep them occupied. All this busyness of life has a purpose. And so he's wanting to know, what is this purpose that God has for our life? And then what he does in verse 11, he makes 3 assertions. Notice, first of all, the first assertion, he has made everything appropriate in its time. Some translations use the word beautiful. And the idea that he's coming to as he's looked at this life, and he's now looking at it from a different perspective, he's saying that every task has a purpose. Every task has a purpose. Now, if every task has a purpose, then it means that we would want to be a good steward of that purpose, of that task. And so just pick one of the examples from the other page and ask, what would be good stewardship in that kind of situation of life? It could be birth. You might use the example of death, or any of them. What would be a good example of someone using that for its purpose? What would God want to accomplish in a person's life? So the first thing he says, every task has a purpose. That's his first assertion. As he's reflecting on this poem, he has a second assertion, and it says, he has also put eternity in their hearts. And he means that God has given, every task is a God-given task, and it contributes to the overall plan of God. God is an eternal being. We're going to see later on, he has a plan and purpose. And so whatever task it is, he has given it to us, and if we're good stewards of it, if we utilize that opportunity, that time, then it's going to contribute in a way we don't see fully at this time, but it will contribute to God's overall plan. That elevates every task that God has placed into our life. Third assertion is in the last part of verse 11, and it says, but no one can discover the work God has done from the beginning. That is, we are limited, and so we can trust God that he has left nothing out. We are limited in our perception and understanding of these things, and so we just simply trust God that he has provided all that's necessary that we need at this opportunity. So these 3 assertions, every task has a purpose. We're not just killing time. Secondly, every God-given task contributes to the big picture of God's plan. And the third is we're limited, but can trust God has left nothing out. And then he says, but no one can discover the work God has done from the beginning to the end. So utilize those things as best you can, whether it's events or circumstances or people, and that is how you go about enjoying life. Now he gives more specifics of that in verses 12 through 13. So how do you enjoy life that God has given us? He says in verse 12, I know that there is nothing better for them than to rejoice and enjoy the good life. Utilize time to do the task God has assigned you to do. Utilize time to do the task that God has assigned you to do. And then he says in verse 13, it is also the gift of God whenever anyone drinks or eats, drinks, or enjoys all his effort. People find enjoyment when they accept that the work is from God and the work is for God. This is how we come to enjoy life. You see what is happening? He's elevating these events that are happening in our lives. They're no longer seen as under the sun, they're over the sun. God is involved in this. And He'll do this ever so often in the book to Jonah, give us hope, and then we'll plunge back into some despairing thoughts. I attended a funeral this week of a man named Alan Moraine. Alan was a successful businessman in our community, was well known. The large church that the service was held at was absolutely filled to the rafters. He was a man that had lots of friends, made a big impact on the community, and was unquestionably a Christian man. This successful businessman, this leader in our community, spent 38 years teaching 9-year-olds in Sunday school. Now tell me, how do you suppose that brought enjoyment to his life? And just spitballing here, how do you suppose God used that to make an impact in His kingdom to accomplish His plan? This is a little task. Doesn't seem to be a big task. Here's a man that you would have thought in worldly standards would have given himself to a bigger task. He was the youngest man to ever be ordained a deacon in his church. He was 25 years old when he was made a deacon. But he enjoyed life because he did his work that he received from God, and he did it for God. And he lived a full and satisfying life. Enjoy life, Solomon says. Now, the third point is God works. Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verses 14 to 15. And the point of the lesson, remember, is wise persons steward time, realizing God controls all things. Years ago, I heard Zig Ziglar give his testimony of how he became a Christian. Zig Ziglar was a motivational speaker. He said that the thing that God used to prompt his heart and to bring him to Christ was he was staying in a motel. There was an older African lady that came in to clean the room. And while he was in the room and she was doing the cleaning, this lady had such a joy, and she talked about the Lord and the joy of the Lord. And God used this woman making beds and picking up in a hotel room to lead that man to faith in Jesus Christ. Listen, if you have a work that's given to you by God, for God, makes no difference what it is. What might be small in the eyes of this world is great in the eyes of God. He can do amazing things with that. And so this passage is talking about God at work. He says in verse 14, I know that everything God does will last forever. He's talking about the eternal significance that the work's going to have. There is no adding to it or taking from it. That is, God's work is comprehensive. He hasn't left anything out when He gives you this work. God works so that people will be in awe of Him. And when you see how God is working, you occasionally get these glimpses, you will have a sense of reverence for God. And every time you have a reverence for God, meaningless goes out the window. It makes no difference what the work is. If you see that God is at work using whatever this task might be, and it causes you to have a sense of reverence, you see a glimpse of the greatness or the goodness or the mercy or the grace of God, what you will have a sense of fulfillment. This sense of emptiness, this sense of meaningless about your work and your life just simply has to flee when it's in the presence of God. Now, the way I want to close the lesson is to tell them a story. Say tomorrow, your bank calls and says, you've just had $1,000 deposited in your account. And of course, that makes you very excited about that. And the person on the phone representing the bank says there's one little detail, though. You have to spend it today. You can't save it, but you have to spend all the $1,000 today. No problem. That'll be easy. And the bank person goes on to say they've made arrangements so that you're going to get another $1,000 tomorrow with the same understanding you have to spend all of it. That's easy. But you're supposed to get $1,000 every day of your life, and you're supposed to spend every dollar of that. Now that's going to start changing some things very dramatically in your life. If you get 7.5 hours sleep a night, you have approximately 1,000 minutes a day. You can't save them for another day. You can't speed them up. You can't slow them down. You have to spend them that day. And if we had an understanding that maybe that was like $1,000 every day, it could be that we would begin to give consideration more to the use of our time. Because what Solomon is wanting to bring us to is this. Since God is in control of all things, and the things that come into your life are things that He understands and He has allowed into your life, then the wise person recognizes this is an opportune time. And I need to seize this opportunity and to use it for God because it's from God. It's a very powerful lesson, and I'm excited about you getting to teach it. God bless you.